So, welcome to another show. We've got Christen Horne on today, who is currently authoring some fantasy books, but was also previously an opera singer as well as a life coach. So, welcome to today's show.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. So good to be here.
So, uh, you're now an author, but were previously an opera singer and a life coach. Can you just talk about that journey and why you are now writing books as opposed to the opera and the life coaching side of things?
Yeah, so it's so funny because when I look back and I kind of take a step back and I look at the whole spectrum or the whole life path, kind of like you said, um, storytelling is always a part of whatever it is that I was doing. Either as an opera singer. Before I was doing that, I was doing musical theater live, and then marketing for as a life coach. That's all about telling a story and communicating really well to your clients and who you want to help. And so it's just been a kind of a crazy journey. So yeah, when I was little, I loved performing, and I wanted to do musical theater because, well, what I really wanted to do when I was little was I wanted to be a film actress. But I grew up in a very small town, well, small for California, and just decided, I completely wrote that off. That wasn't possible for me. So I was like, well, I'll do musical theater. And then the more I sang, because everybody always said, oh, you have such a beautiful voice. The more I sang, the more I took lessons with my grandma. She was my first voice teacher, and she was an opera singer. And she was like, you need to do opera. And I was like, grandma, I don't want to do opera. And then when I was applying for colleges, it turned out everybody wanted this classical repertoire. So I was like, okay, grandma, what have you got for me? And so that's kind of where my opera journey started. I found an amazing voice teacher at doing my undergrad for my bachelor's, and he really pulled me into his vision and passion for opera. And I have a very good work ethic. I work very hard, and I have a good practice ethic, which is, what you need to master the technique for opera. And so I did very well, very quickly, and was able to make some pretty impressive sounds while I was still pretty young for an opera singer. And so I did that for 10 years. And like a couple years, no, yeah, okay. So a couple years after I graduated, I was overweight. I was super unhappy, lots of self-loathing. And one of my opera friends had gotten into an MLM. Oh, but this is one of the good ones. And so she helped me lose a bunch of weight. She was my first coach. And then I got really excited because I was able to do it. And I was like, oh my gosh, I want to help other people do this too. And that's kind of, so I started as a health coach, and then I moved into life coaching, and because I was doing a lot of thinking about the psychology of things. And I got really passionate about helping a specific group of people, geeks and gamers, like those people that go, they dress up, and they go to midnight premieres at the movies, and they're all waving their lightsabers around. And that is me, those are my people. And I'm so passionate still about helping them. And I worked for 7 or 8 years as a life coach, working on the marketing, working on the niche, and working on my program, the tools that I wanted to put together and develop for them. And it just flopped real hard. And kind of the entire time, it was another case of those, somebody had a vision for me. So it's the same. That's also kind of a pattern for me. My first voice teacher had a vision for me and all this potential. And then my coach also had a vision for me, and her coach had a vision for me and all of this potential. And I got so swept up in their visions for me that I kept ignoring maybe what I wanted my vision for me to be, because I was just so busy telling myself that it was impossible. The film acting, I hated writing in high school and in college. All of the rules and all of the shoulds, and it was all very noisy and cramped, and it wasn't fun at all. The one little bit of writing that I did when I was younger was poetry. For whatever reason, I was able to do some poetry. And I guess bringing this all around, I got to my master's in opera performance, and I was having technique issues, where there was a bunch of tension in my singing. And for anybody who's like familiar with like the chakras and stuff, like you've got to primary chakra right here, your throat chakra. And that's very difficult to deal with as an opera singer if your chakra's all messed up. And so, and it wouldn't go away. And so I got to the end of my master's finally deciding, like, I'm going to take a break, I guess, because I don't know what else to do. It didn't matter. Like like I said, I'm a very good practicer. I take input very well. I was doing a lot of troubleshooting and nothing seemed to work. And so I finally decided to take a break right before COVID. And then COVID enforced the break a little bit longer because nobody was singing live, let alone opera, during COVID. And I started to tap into myself. I decided to get off of social media during COVID, which seems like an insane idea. But it gave me a lot of space, finally, for once, after like 10 years, to listen to myself and what I really wanted. And then I started to realize I missed the character work, the getting into a character's mindset, figuring out who they are, why they behave the way they behave, why did they react the way that they react, what's, how does their old family life influence how they're reacting in the play or the opera today, in this moment, the one that we're witnessing on stage. And I always loved that work. And so I decided to apply all of that to my most recent Dungeons and Dragons game. And there was my book. Just all of a sudden, I was working on my character's backstory, and my book kind of just appeared to me. And I didn't even realize it at first. My husband looked over my shoulder at my laptop one day and he said, "Those look like chapter titles." And I was like, oh my gosh. And I had no intentions of publishing a book. I was just writing for fun, to have some sort of creative outlet during COVID, because during COVID, people can't tell you, no, you can't write a book. You're like, I'm writing, there's nothing to do. And it was better than being on, like, scrolling through Facebook, being on social media. And that was what, 3 years ago now, 4 years ago. And so, yeah, I'm still, the book turned into 3. And so we're still working on it. And I brought a co-author on board. He's the one that runs the game. And I never, ever, 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 ever thought I would be a writer, like, ever.
It's funny though, because a couple of things you said there sort of really resonate with me. One is the COVID period. So 2 things you said that happened to me exactly as well. One is that I wrote a book during COVID.
Yeah.
So exactly the same.
Such a great idea.
Yeah.
Like...
I mean, you're there. And I think the thing with the COVID situation is, well, first of all, I'm a strong believer that something positive can come out of something negative. Regardless of how big negative is, there will be something positive to come out of it. And one of the positives that's happened for not just both ourselves, but society on the whole, is time to reflect, to say, is this the right job for me? Do I want to work from home more often? What are the important things in my life? What direction am I heading? As you said as well, is it the vision someone else has given me, my manager, my CEO, society, my family, or is it a vision that I've actually decided to create myself? And it's quite important to, as you said, be the master of your own ship and create your own life path. So you worked as a life coach as well, and you talked about applying what you've learned to your own life, but also to teach to others. So what did you learn being a coach?
I learned that because I, as a life coach, you go listen to other life coaches, you get coached by other life coaches. And I'm still being coached. Like, that for my mental health, I get coached twice a week. It's a great program. I love it. But as a life coach, what I learned is that marketing can be very challenging. And I'm trying to figure out how to express this kind of concisely, but also just accurately, is if you have kind of any degree of insecurity in what you're selling, that's going to make things very difficult. That's for me. And it was just kind of this underlying discord in the whole project. I knew that I was a good coach. I knew that I had really good ideas, really useful ideas for very, very important people that I think can change the world. Like, I 100% believe in all those. But there was this seed of something is wrong. And any little thing that went wrong in trying to set up your funnel, right? Because if you don't know, setting up a funnel, like if you've got a program to sell, you want to help people with, then you don't have to do anything. But I was doing Facebook ads to get the clicks and get people, like give them the free ebook to like, offer them the program. And any little part of like testing that, or if I got like a negative comment, the haters, there was a lot, because I was working with a niche that most people wouldn't even consider trying to market to for life coaching. And I took things very personally. It felt very vulnerable, very scary, which normally, like, those aren't necessarily contraindications. That's not necessarily something that means you need to pull away from this project. It was so difficult to work through all of the challenges.
Yeah.
Like, right. And there are a lot of challenges. And that, again, is not necessarily a reason to quit or to stop. You can work through those challenges. And I know that if I had kept going, I could have done it. But it got to the point where I just didn't want to. So I guess maybe that's coming all the way around. My coach talks a lot about doing things because of like a deep desire want, not the flitty, like surface level wants, the deep desire wants.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't want to do this anymore.
Yeah.
It didn't feel right. I know I keep pointing to like my chest, but there was that feeling like in the center of my chest, like a heavy, just dissonance is the best way that I can put it. And yeah, those weren't the challenges that I wanted to work through, or at least for that, because the hysterical thing is now I'm facing marketing again, because marketing is everything, for my book, and everything clicks. All of the advice that I got, all of the programs, like the marketing courses that I took, I'm able to use all of that now for my book. And I really couldn't care less if something goes wrong, or if somebody says your book sucks, or somebody's like, hey, like, this is stupid. Oh my gosh, so much cringe. Like, I've gotten comments like that, and I just don't care.
That's
It's such a nice place to be in, right? Because I was trying to get there for my life coaching, and I never could. I couldn't even really get there for opera. You get that feedback on your singing and on like laying your soul like just to bear, and people criticize it, and it's so difficult to deal with. And I think that's, it's all about discernment, right? Is figuring out. So that's another thing I think that I've learned is I've learned discernment, or at least a little better. I think my discernment skill has leveled up. And that has been invaluable, really, for I'm only 30-ish years old. So now I've got the rest of my life with this extra discernment skill of like, okay, great, this is awesome.
Yeah. There's loads of things there, isn't there? There's like, what are the fears that I'm subject to? Is it the fear of rejection, as you said, by negative comments? Is it fear of insecurity, or the insecurity comment you made, rather? Is it down to authenticity? Are you
right?
Is it that you're not authentically yourself, which means that you feel negative comments more than you should do? Is it imposter syndrome, that you don't feel that you are worthy of that? And the challenges that you mentioned as well, it's overcoming those challenges as you have done, which makes you the person you are today.
Yeah.
And the beauty of it as well is the pace of today's world means that you can have a life within a decade. You can be a singer for a decade. You can be a coach for a decade. You can be a builder for a decade. Because of that fast-paced nature and the amount of information that's available online, you can learn code in a month. You can learn trading in a month, whatever. Not that you're going to be really good at it or anything like that, but you can at least start that process.
Learn the base skills. Yeah.
You can write a book. And I think that's a really important part. And a couple of things that you said it twice, basically. One is about the chakras and that gut feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And the second was about your boyfriend, I think you said, where he said, are they chapter titles?
Yeah.
Something
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
and something I don't think people can really put this into words, but something just feels right, doesn't it?
Yes.
About what you're doing or what people have said to you.
Yep.
So if we take your life as a life path or a hero's journey or a life journey, you're at this point now. Where do you feel that that path's going to take you in the future, or is it a case of not knowing at this point?
Well, I mean, I mean, I think I kind of like you said, like finding everything just feels right. And then there's like this concept of alignment, right? And which I wasn't feeling with life coaching, and I wasn't feeling as an opera singer. There were things like that I loved about those two vocations, and but things that just weren't in alignment with me as an artist, with what I wanted to do as a storyteller. That I've found just all it there's so much alignment in being an author for me as just or just in writing. Kind of in contrast for the challenges that I faced as an opera singer and as a coach, I see the challenges of as that writers face, and I'm like all in, like I'm here for it, and they don't feel as hard. And so when I take a step back and I look at that, I'm like, I think this is what I'm meant to do. I think this is like, I could write all day, maybe not all day, but I could write a long time every day and be just thrilled, because it's just pure creative process. And I love it so much, especially getting to collaborate with my co-author. Um, it just, it's those, So when I was as a coach, you're reading all of these entrepreneur books, right? All business books, everything. And there was this concept of being the entrepreneur that, got home from their 9 to 5 and then worked till 3 in the morning, right? Not necessarily the hustle and grind idea, because
Yeah,
that I'm not a huge proponent of. Burnout is not good. Don't drive yourself to burnout. I did that a lot. But having that drive, just wanting to, right? You want to do this so badly that you come home exhausted from your 9 to 5 and you get back to work. This, as a writer, that's the first time I've ever felt that. And acting, actually, because right now I'm submitting a lot of self-tapes, auditions to do film acting as well. And these are the two areas that I could have zero energy and still somehow find more
yeah,
to do what I need to do for that day. And that to me is like, okay, this is it. Like this is what I'm supposed to do. Um, so I will probably, in terms of like, where do I see this going? Like, I'll probably be doing this for the rest of my life. I have no intentions to ever stop writing,
yeah,
because it feels awesome. And I suppose I could get to the end of an arc of my life and that feeling could fade, but I don't think so. And thankfully, because of my journey, I think if that happens, it's not going to be the end of the world. Like, I know what to do. I'll find something, some sort of outlet, something that will be in alignment with wherever that new phase is going.
yeah,
So that also is pretty priceless, to have just kind of like that confidence, that certainty that like, no matter what happens, I'm gonna be okay. So yeah, I think pretty much I'm here. I'm gonna be a writer. Like I really want to be like the next. I know this is like shooting for the stars, right? But I want to be the next like release the next like Harry Potter sort of thing.
yeah,
Like I like this story I've been reading my whole life. Star Wars books, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, like everything. I read so much. And this is kind of my world. And I look at this story that my co-author and I are building, and it's like, this is good. This is good storytelling. And there's a lot of bad storytelling going on right now, which is frustrating,
yeah,
because they're coming out of like huge studios that have huge budgets. And I'm like, I know you could have found a better writer for this. I'm very passionate about this. But yeah, I'm here as a storyteller, I think, to stay. And I'm thrilled. And I'm also really curious to see how all of the previous endeavors kind of represent themselves and reintegrate themselves into what I'm doing next, because that's not going to go away. I'm still very passionate about helping, the geeks and gamers pull themselves out of games and start applying what they do in video games to real life and solving like real life problems, because really the amount of determination and ingenuity in gamers is astounding. And if we can harness that and apply that to real world issues, oh my gosh, like just the amount of advances that we would make, it's insane. And so that passion, that's still there, right? And so it's really something that I've learned as a writer, but particularly as a fantasy writer, is to kind of sit and listen and wait for my world to talk to me. And so right now it's nice to be kind of also in that space for these other passions, singing, kind of any style, and then also this group of people that I'm so passionate about helping and instilling that confidence in them. It'll be interesting to see how that comes into play, and if or when any of that will manifest, and how it will manifest in the future. So yeah, it's a wild place to be in.
I mean, I've just made like 10 different bullet points there, because there's so many great things you've said there. I think we'll start with the writing side of things. Sounds to me like you're getting to flow state where you can write for hours 100%. And you don't worry about burnout, because if you the reason you get burnout is because you are overworked and you're not in that creative state. If you're in that creative state and you're doing something you love, the chance of burnout is very, very small. It's negligible.
Very small.
Yes.
Yep.
If you're doing a physical activity like sport, obviously, your muscles can only do so much.
Yep.
And even your mind, it does need a rest. But in terms of that soul exhaustion, I call it, where it's burnout, you don't get that, because you are enjoying what you're doing. And yeah, we change over time. Your passion might not be the same forever, because you probably didn't foresee this 5-10 years ago. And it's
definitely not.
See where you as a character goes in your own story.
Yeah.
You want to be the protagonist, and how that works. And I think you made a really good point as well with your old passions are finding a place within your new passions. And I call that skill stacking.
Yeah.
Where you've got various skills and you are now an individual person with all of these skills to use in a very niche way that no one else has those set of skills. If that makes sense. So let's talk about characters then, because we've talked a little about your life path. I want to touch on Lord of the Rings, because I know that and Dungeons and Dragons have been. I'm not familiar with Dungeons and Dragons too much, but I am Lord of the Rings, so we'll stick with that one. We're going to talk a bit about the characters and their life paths before we move on to your story, a bit about your book and how you think about the characters and the complexities, and as you said, what makes a good story and how you go about telling it. So who's your favorite character then in Lord of the Rings? Samwise Gamgee.
Samwise Gamgee.
Because he's one of the real heroes in some respects, isn't he?
Yes. There's so much, there's a lot, not coming out, but circulating on social media. As my sister will send them to me, because I'm not really on social. I am on social media, but I don't go scroll. But my sister will send me stuff, and there's I think there's even a letter from Tolkien referring to Sam as kind of the main character. We focus a lot on Frodo because he is the one that had to bear the burden and do the very difficult thing. But then you realize it's just this line especially from the way it was delivered in the movie, is that Frodo wouldn't have gotten very far without Sam. And that's always been a huge theme for me in my life. Is I have few friends. I'm an introvert, so I have few friends, but they're very strong friendships. And that's something that's always been very high value for me. And so seeing that in a book, that is just, and in a story, it's just somebody gets it, right? And that's always been why I love reading. And then probably second to Sam, just by a hair, is Aragorn. And just watching.
I love it. You've got the same two characters as me.
Yeah.
Genuinely,
Watching Aragorn's character, because what's amazing about Sam is he is so steadfast the entire time, never wavers, never doubts. He is always there supporting Frodo 100%. He'll call Frodo, he'll ask questions when he's wait, are you sure this doesn't sound like a good idea? And there's so much wisdom in Sam, simple wisdom, but wisdom nonetheless, that we think, so to kind of apply it to modern sensibilities, we kind of think we're above it sometimes. Oh, we're smarter than that. It's no. Tolkien's point is very clear. We're never above simple wisdom,
Yeah.
because there's just a strength to it. And then but Aragorn's character does progress, right? He goes from like wanting to play small, wanting to stay small. He's like, I don't want to go there. And for a very valid reason. I think that's something that we have to like pay attention to. Sometimes the reasons we give ourselves for playing small is valid or are valid, right? Like they're valid reasons. They're very scary. Aragorn did not want to repeat the mistakes of his ancestors. And they were catastrophic. So that's fair, I think. Like, yeah, I wouldn't want to repeat those mistakes either. But that doesn't mean like if you have the opportunity to take up the mantle and set things right, then do your best to make sure that you don't make the same mistake that your ancestors made, and be better. And do the hard work and face the scary thing and be better. And there's a lot of other things, like a lot of layers to Aragorn as a character. That's just one of them. But that's a huge one for me. It resonates with me a lot.
Yeah, I mean the thing that I like about both those characters is their character traits. The fact that they're courageous, they have integrity, they're noble, they
Yes.
sacrifice for others, and they are protectors by nature. And I think they're the traits that I like most. I mean, I like all the characters, don't get me wrong, because
They're
without
all
the
great.
characters, you don't have. I mean, even in stories, you need that idiot who you hate because you need the films without that or stories without that. You haven't got that emotional hatred that gets you really boiled up inside.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. So
Yeah.
so yeah, I think that with those two characters, what okay, here's a question then. So their favorite two characters. What key parts of the story do you feel that they show their best traits in the best way?
Oh, I'm gonna cry. So Sam, there's that moment in Return of the King where Sam, the worst has happened. Sam has been abandoned. Gollum has managed to convince Frodo that Sam is trying to steal the ring or is trying to sabotage things.
Yeah.
And Frodo abandons Sam and says, "Go home." And Sam, finds the lembas bread, right? And turns around and goes back. And Sam is the reason that they succeeded. But like, period. There's just no arguing that. And so that moment when Sam is hurt and had every right to go home and say, fine, I gave you everything and you just basically threw it in my face. And he turns around anyway because he's amazing. But that sense of loyalty and steadfastness, and I think loyalty right there is the bright shining. But also like, no, we're gonna finish the thing. We're gonna do this. We're gonna see this through. But I think ultimately, really, it comes down to love for Frodo. He loved his friend so much and he knew that Gollum meant ill, and it didn't matter what it was going to cost Sam. He was going to go back to save his friend. That moment, that's a huge moment for me with Sam. And then for Aragorn, the moment that pops, there's so many good moments for all of them.
Yeah, absolutely.
But so I'll tell you the first one that popped into my head is actually at the very end. And it's when everybody's kneeling to Aragorn because he's at the coronation.
Love it.
And then he tells the hobbits to stand back up. He says, "You kneel to no one," and then he kneels to them, and that's just like just
Goosebumps
so
moment.
much humility and grace and, like you said, nobility. And those are just, I know those are both later moments. There's so many good moments for both characters throughout the whole thing, but those two moments were the first ones that came to mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great film, and it's fantasy is its own genre, but even people who don't like those sort of books or films love Lord of the Rings. What is it do you think
Yeah,
that makes it so good? Is it the storytelling? Is it the characters? What
it's
is it exactly?
okay. This is gonna get a little philosophical, I think, but that's
Which is good.
because
Love
Tolkien
philosophy.
at Tolkien like was a very religious man. He was Catholic. He believed in so many of these truths that he believed were universal goods and universal evils and universal like combat and battles between them, right? And that's what he instilled and distilled in his storytelling. And I think that's why I think whatever you believe, there he was tapping into these universal ideas that everybody gravitates to and is like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. So I think that's why I think he really tapped into it's like the word he uses is myth. And I recently saw a little tidbit on this about how most people use the word myth as something fictional, right? Oh, it's the myth or the myth of this or the myth of that. And Tolkien actually used the word very differently. He used the word to refer to the universal truths that like you couldn't articulate any other way. Except to kind of create some fantasy or fiction around it, because that pulled it out of kind of the real world context so that everybody could understand it. And that's why I think, just in a nutshell, why I've always adored fantasy, because you still get to wrestle with these very real world values and conflicts and problems, but you get to wrestle with them out of the context of the real world, where like the real world, because we've got prejudices, right? We look at something, we're like, oh, well, I don't trust that because this person said it, or I don't trust that because it came from this news source or whatever. And sometimes that, like I said, like that's valid. But when you pull it out and you put it in a fictional world, it's like it gives us space to consider the thing itself more objectively. Strangely enough, as much emotion and storytelling as goes into them, you get to really consider the thing. And I think that has been a big bonus to growing up reading fantasy, because I think it has allowed me to be a more empathetic person, understand these concepts, whether I've experienced them personally or not. I on some level, like I've seen it, I've witnessed it, because reading is such an intimate thing.
So do you think there's like specific philosophical ideas or like a not a cheat sheet so much, but like a structure or a process that, like a little bit like the hero's journey. I don't know if you've seen the hero's journey wheel.
Yeah.
It's like call to adventure,
Mm-hmm.
mentor, um, understands that he's got to go through challenges, etc., and then returns home as a new person. That
Mm-hmm.
aside, because I think that's pretty obvious that there's, most famous stories are a hero's journey. As you said,
You
Harry
can see that in
Potter.
Frodo very easily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But is there
Yeah.
anything else? I know you mentioned the religious side of things that specifically that the listeners would be able to tangibly remember. Oh, I remember this in the film, and what that sort of idea is essentially.
Um, it's been a long time since I've oh well, I mean, there's really simple ones. There's a lot of like, are you want to get into like the religious one specifically?
Yeah, whichever. Yeah, whichever's comfortable.
Because like, well, so yeah, Tolkien was like deeply Catholic, and so there are lot of analogs between Jesus Christ and Aragorn, tons of them. I can't remember a lot of the specifics, but if you're familiar with Judeo Christianity, and then you can go back and like I mean him being the king, like he's like hiding, and or I mean Jesus never really hid, but he did have moments where he was like, this is not my time, this is not my time, and then there was a very specific trajectory. And so kind of Aragorn's process is a little different, But eventually, like he is the prophesied king, and he arrives there at the end, to rule Gondor and hopefully lead humanity in a better direction. It gets much deeper than that. I'm not an expert, but the easier one though is probably what's his name? Gandalf. Gandalf falls, he dies, and then he literally dies, and then he is resurrected. He's no longer Gandalf the Grey, he's now Gandalf the White. So that's a pretty that's pretty explicit.
I
Pretty
think
explicit
one
analogy
of
there.
the ones for me that has just come to mind now is the metaphor of, obviously we can talk about good and evil, all of that, but if I think of Sauron, the deceit to
Mm-hmm.
control a wide populace through a very small number of people. If we look at the
Mm-hmm.
world today, I see a lot of similarities with how the world is.
Well, also Sauron, great. I hadn't even thought about Sauron, but Sauron manipulating the mortal races with power, just like it's a very sinister. Like, here you go, you can have power, and then they all basically like end themselves because they become greedy. They start fighting over the power. They all fall because of this. Like, very like, here you go, it's gonna be great, except for the elves, because the elves are basically perfect in Tolkien in Tolkien's world, which is fine. But
It just shows you just power's relative though, doesn't it? Because when the rings were given out, they had control over, let's say, their populace in some respects, but
yeah,
then there was this one ring that had control over
yep,
people with those rings. And it's like a
right,
businesses, or you might be a ring holder in your own house. Yeah, you might be the boss of your
right,
own house, but when you step out to your workplace, you drop down the rungs and
right,
help
right.
you. And then if you go to, somewhere else out the country, then again you fall down. There's,
Yeah,
as you said, there's so many layers to the book. So how do
so many
you
layers.
how
It's
do
it's
you create? Because you're obviously an author now, you're writing a number of books.
mhm.
Yeah, we'll talk about the story in a second, but how do you actually simplify the complexity of a story like that into something you can write? Do you plan it on like a big whiteboard and look at it in that way, or is it just a case of having the idea and writing it, obviously with your co-author as well?
Yeah, so there are two kind of two sets of authors, sort of, and I'll use the terms that I was taught, but I think there are more sophisticated terms for them than this. There are plotters and there are pantsers.
Yeah,
And pantsers is kind of a derogatory kind of, and it's more like, because Stephen King is a pantser. He discovers the story as he's writing. That's and then the plotters are the ones that do the whiteboard thing, right?
yeah,
They outline everything, and they get all the little details in line, and then they start writing. And then the good ones will allow things to change. I was studying with an amazing plotter there for a little bit. I read a couple of his books, and like, he's very intelligent writer, and very good at really delivering what readers want out of a story. But he's very analytical and very cerebral about it. So I am not that. Like, I do get cerebral. I think some of the analytics that has to come into play, because otherwise you end up with plot holes. You end up with plot holes. They don't, things that don't make sense. Characters act out of character, or they do something, and it's just, so you have to be. It requires a lot of awareness. But for me, I just start asking questions. I don't know why this became my process, but I think it's probably because of well, first of all, kind of the set in the context of Dungeons and Dragons, me as a player asking the DM or the game master, the guy who's running and creating the world, I just ask him a bunch of questions. Be like, okay, what about this, or what about this, or what about this? And so I just started asking a bunch of questions, both to him, my co-author, and to myself. And that's where it all started. I think it also kind of goes back to how I used to create characters when I was doing shows, musical theater, opera, and digging in. You just have to start asking these questions and figure out, where can I find the information for this, and begin to embody a real person, as fictional as they are. That my job is to make them real. And what I love about writing is that's the whole gig, is figuring out how to make these people real people, not make, but allow them really to be real people. Oh my gosh, I keep hitting my mic. And allowing the world to be real, like a living, breathing world. And then the challenge, like you said, is to like narrow that focus and narrow the scope into telling one story. And kind of like the initial question is there, it's just like, okay, well, what happens? And that question won't work for everybody. It really depends on how you think about the writing process. I am so appreciative of Stephen King, and because I read his fantasy epic, the Dark Tower series, way back. And there was a way that he talked about writing in that book, and then in his book on writing, he talks about just like kind of, I mentioned earlier, just allowing allowing yourself to discover the world and allowing the world to speak to you, almost like you are the conduit for your world to manifest in ours. And so there, for me, living in that space, the pressure to create or to come up with something interesting, non-existent. I have no judgments. This is what happens in the story. And so that I clashed a little bit with the other guy, the other writer whose books I was reading, because he talks about, making different decisions, and changing the story if it's more powerful or more gut-wrenching or something. And for me, that felt too contrived. Or like, I sure, like, I could keep asking the world, be like, well, what if something else happened? And I think, like our world, right, there are multiple timelines pretty much in any world. Like decisions, one decision leads you down one path. And if you had made a different decision there, you'd go down another path. Or if you'd made a third decision there, it goes down, right? So it's lots of branches and spider webbing, right? And so I think that's true for my world. But I'm not going to change it just because I think it might sell better or might be more interesting or might like be like, no, I'm pretty sure this is just what happens. And if a reader likes it, great. And if they don't, oh well, this is what I think happens in the story. And then sometimes that has to change because something else like kind of is revealed to us, and we're like, oh, well, that doesn't line up here, but this is more important. We think this is more true. And so then we have to go back and make sure that everything stays lined up. And so I don't know if I answered the question, but basically, to avoid overwhelm, try to narrow your focus in one moment at a time. And then you stay in that moment, but it is a lot of zooming in and zooming out and zooming in and zooming out and zooming in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. And as you said, you either get the pantsers or those who basically plot the story out themselves. So you talked a lot there. Well, you mentioned it probably 4 or 5 times. My world. Can you talk
Oh
about the
yeah.
world in the world of the book? Because obviously, as we said, you've got the Lord of the Rings world, you've got Harry Potter's world.
Yeah.
What is your world? And then we'll talk a bit about the story behind or the plot of the story in some respects without giving too much away.
Yeah, so one of the inspirations that we take from Tolkien is we try to be very thorough with our world building. And I cannot remember, my husband would be so ashamed of me. I can't remember the whole world's name for Tolkien because it does exist. But we're more familiar with the term Middle Earth. Like we love going to Middle Earth. We love being there. It's why they keep making new stories so that we can go back to Middle Earth. So our world is called Urda, Urda, and it's little by little we're filling it out. So right now it's like it's a disc world, so it's flat and it's round, well, flat and round, but you know what I mean. So it's flat, but it's a disc, and it's got a world tree in the center. So right off the bat, you can see the influences from like Yggdrasil, which is the world tree. So we've taken kind of that idea, but then changed it a little bit, which is kind of the you could just say that about every decision that we've made. It's like, okay, we see this influence in and what we want to do with our story, and then we tweak it a little bit, which has just been so much fun. So yeah, it's a disc world. There's a world tree. What else is there? So we've got elves because it's a fantasy world. We've got elves, we've got dwarves, we've got We've got halflings, but these halflings are very, very different. And there's not a lot in our first trilogy. So if you love halflings, great, like follow us because they will come into play, but they're not in our first trilogy. This first trilogy focuses a lot more on the humans and the interactions with the humans and the elves. And set in a very particular time. The elves like had a big forest, but then some terrible catastrophe happened and their forest shrank. And so now the moment in time for our first trilogy is the smaller elven forest, kind of dealing with kind of an England analog that we call Gresha. Yeah, that's kind of the little bit of the setting for the first trilogy. And then like it's a fantasy world, and if you're familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, we've got these things called aberrants or aberrations. We've moved away from, because originally when we started writing this, we were going to try to get the license from not Paizo, that's Pathfinder. Oh my gosh, Wizards. We were gonna pitch it to Wizards and try to get the license to use all of their creatures. But then thankfully my co-author, he is amazing and he just can create different creatures and monsters. And so we decided to move away. We're doing all like non-copyrighted stuff and just kind of creating our own creatures and monsters and redoing everything, which has been so much fun. Like right now we're working on developing in Dungeons and Dragons. I don't think this is super true in Lord of the Rings. But there's these things called like dryads and naiads, like wood spirits and water spirits. So we're kind of working on that race right now. And it's just been super fun. If you think like what elves are and how they should behave, like, and or if you're like dying for something different, come check us out, because like we just have so much fun. And that's been another influence from like my readings as a coach. I learned a lot about like cultures and values, right? If you follow Tony Robbins, he talks a lot about values and how your values influence you. A lot of people talk about that, but that's one of his like primary pillars, I think. And so I was like, okay, well, let's start with this culture's values and how does that show up and how does that manifest, and then so why do they do what they do? And so we did that for like, we have like basically 6 different races of elves. It's not just elves, and they're all very diverse and interesting and different, which has been just so much fun. So
It's
yeah,
anything creative like that is always really fun, isn't it? To get involved in like, oh, we can play around with this and move this.
yes, yep,
Building that Lego house really out of words and what's in your mind. So you've designed the world. You sort of know where the story is going to take place. Have you got the plot of the story?
oh yeah,
And
the first draft
can
for
you
our
give
trilogy.
can you give a bit of an insight as to what that is? And the sort of intricate, not necessarily intricacies, because obviously you don't want to give too much about the book away, but
Yeah.
what the sort of story outline is in some respects.
Yeah. So the first drafts for our trilogy is they're done. Things we'll tweak things a little bit. Book 1 needs the most work, which is why it's difficult to give kind of like a publishing date. Because we work on book 1 and we get to book 2 and book 3 and we're like, oh my gosh, this is all so much better, and then we have to go to book 1 and fix everything. Or fill it all out, right? General plot. Yeah. So we've got 2 protagonists. One is a monster hunter. She's loosely based on the ranger class from Dungeons and Dragons. So kind of like Aragorn. Very, very attuned with nature, really good with a bow. And she's a monster hunter, and she loves hunting down these terrible aberrant monsters that are threatening basically her country. And she's very good at it. And she's very abrasive and very kind of a firebrand, and she gets into a lot of trouble. But she's also very like convicted, and she hates politics, and the big city that she lives in is basically run by politics, because like most big cities are. And she's trying to fight both the outer corruption of the aberrant monsters, but also the inner corruption of the city. And so she just does not play political game with anybody, and that ends up making her very valuable to hire, because that particular city right now or in the time of the book, is seeing a transition of power from the old kind of like the nobles having all the power and getting all of the say, to the merchant class getting all of the power. And so they're fighting at the time of the book. And so she's kind of just a mercenary, finds herself in the middle of that, and just has no patience for any of it because she's looking at all of the people who need help, and she's like, you guys are fighting over stupid stuff, like just help the people. And so she makes that her business to do. And then the second part of it, so there's a lot in that city and the city dynamics, and that's a large part of the plot, is her interacting with the political powers, basically through books 1 and 3. And then the second half is, like I said, the elves kind of come into play when something happens in book 1 where she needs to go commission some very fancy arrows from an elf who is very good at making arrows. And so she goes and she meets him, and then he's like, well, you're weird and different and interesting, because he's 300 years old and he's bored, basically, with his people's particular way of doing things. And so the other half of the trilogy is basically a love story, them figuring out a relationship and figuring out, is it going to work, can we stay together, because they're very different people, and she does not fit into his society really well at all. This particular set of elves is fairly typical to Tolkien elves, but the rest of them are very different, and we introduce, and they've got some differences too. It's kind of like, you give them a little bit of the same, and then to ease them in to being they're not carbon copies, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we've got that dynamic, and then he ends up being also a very important figure. He's basically their religious leader. So that's like one of the things, like I like to say, is like, oh, if the elven pope falls in love with a pagan hunter, like what happens?
Yeah, the opposite end of the scale in some respects.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a really fun dynamic, and it's a very there's a lot of I'm trying to figure out how to say it. It's a lot of internal monologue, right? So a lot of very not cerebral, but very much paying attention to the characters, their thoughts, like as crazy as some of those thoughts are, and then why they react the way they react because of what their inner monologue is telling them. And a lot of I guess a very psychological component, because my influences as a coach, but also as an actor, that's everything, right? Is their history, their past traumas, their family situation, like what's going on, and it just all comes together, and it's this big tangled mess. But then there's the dissonances and the consonances, and it's all very it's amazing. I love it so much.
It's like piecing together a jigsaw puzzle, isn't it? You've got all of these pieces, the world itself, the characters, the elves, the different traits, and it's trying to make sure that, as you said, it's coherent but also exciting at the same time. Is that the interesting part, the exciting part, and also the difficult part, all in the same vein?
Yeah. It's like I said, it's like a lot of zooming in and then zooming out, right? It's almost like composing a piece. And then that's all of my classical music training has been coming into in handy, because our elves are very musical. So there's like we like to say it's fantasy, so their souls are made of sound. And they're all from like different their deities. There's like one deity per clan, right? And so they all, like, part of the world building was like, okay, this clan doesn't like this clan because their individual notes, because we have it like written out which notes are which. These notes are very dissonant, at least to our ears. So this clan doesn't like this clan. This clan does like this clan, because that's a nice harmony in music. And it's been so much fun to play with.
So, because I've written one book, which is a non-fiction self-help book.
Yeah.
And another book about questions and how to ask myself, or how to ask ourselves questions to see whether you want to be in
good
5 years,
questions
whatever.
too.
Yeah, questions are
Good
great because
questions.
without
Yeah,
asking the right questions, we can't get the right answer. And my question to you
exactly.
would be, because I have considered writing a non-fiction book at some, sorry, a fiction book at some point.
Yeah.
How would I start? Where would you say that I would need to
Oh,
start from? Would it be having an idea of an ending and working backwards? Would it be, as you said, creating the world? Where would you think I would start? Because
oh,
someone said to me actually, they said, "Oh, you should write a fiction book." I was like, to be honest with you, number one is I read more non-fiction than fiction books,
yeah.
and two, I wouldn't know where to start. So maybe you might be able to give me some pointers.
Do you have an idea? No. Okay.
No, not yet. No.
Yeah. So for me, it did start with an end because these
Okay.
first this first story is my character's backstory.
Okay.
So the
Okay. Yeah.
end
Yeah.
was they get together, they have this kid, and that's my character. So spoilers.
Okay.
But so I did start with an end. And then I just started asking questions from there. How did they get there? Right. And
Okay.
you can ask yeah, and you just ask a lot of follow-up questions like, well, what happened there? Well, how does that work out? Well, what if this, especially for things that don't make sense? Those are like the best opportunities. Like I think a lot of people look at things that don't make sense and they freak out. They're like, I'm a terrible author. This is awful. It's like, no, look at those and like and face them and be like, get curious about them. Be like, how well, A, does it really not make sense? B, how could it make sense? Or C, like, how could you change it?
That's true.
Like just yeah. So allowing kind of, and then going back to that discernment idea is figuring out what are the important points, because there were like fixed, like in Doctor Who he talks about fixed point in time, and so we've had fixed points in our story for a long time, and so those don't change, but almost but there are very few of those, and so everything else is pretty fluid. You just kind of allow for that flexibility, to allow the world to like reveal itself to you more and more, or the story, not even just the world. So where would I start? Me personally, I started with the end, but it's also going to depend on kind of your creative style. um there was a story I wanted to tell. There was like, and there were um that's the simplest way of putting, but there were messages within that story that I was very passionate about communicating well, to just other readers, and so those are my I don't know if lodestone is the proper term for that, but those are kind of like my guiding lights. I was kind
Okay.
of, if I get lost, which is very rare, I come back to those. We're like, okay, well, what's ultimately like most important about telling this story?
Like the checkpoints in the story, basically. You
Kind
might
of,
be
yeah.
meandering off in the countryside for a second. You
Right, right.
need to get back on the road and go to the next junction, basically.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah,
So
and then allowing for that too, though. Sometimes the detours, they fill out the world. So we don't
yeah,
delete that. It just might not make it into the book. It
yeah,
exists. Yeah.
yeah. Is the book in chronological order, or is it like
Yes.
so it isn't chronological, so it's telling the story until a point in time, as opposed to
There
they get
are in
prequels
book
and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, so in book one, there are a couple of flashbacks as
Okay.
things currently stand,
Okay.
because we wanted to dive into the story at a particular point, and then we wanted to show how these particular characters came together. Kind of like there was an episode of Firefly, if I don't know if you watched it, it was a sci-fi show. And it only got one
Yeah.
season, and it was amazing. But there's this episode where um, it tells you a story, but basically through flashbacks. We don't do the whole thing, but like we took some inspiration from that. At least, like I said, as things currently stand, I think that will stay.
Okay.
But book one right now is it will see the most changes.
Okay.
But for the most part, yeah, it's all chronological.
So I know that you said that you haven't got a date yet for when the books are going to be out because you're doing the
Yeah.
drafting, etc. But if people are going to wait and look out for this book, I'm sure you probably haven't got a title yet, or have you? And if you've not got
Oh,
a
no.
title, have you got your author names or pen names that you're going to be using for the book?
Yeah, and actually what we're doing right now is because we have been my co-author and I, we've been such big nerds ourselves and big readers. What we decided to do was release our chapters for free. So the trilogy is called The Bell and the Bow. We don't have like individual book names yet. We're still workshopping those. We're pretty sure the first book will be called Overstrung, which is an archery kind of has the archery feel. Yeah, The Bell and the Bow. And if you want to go check out the books, like if you like fantasy, if you like Lord of the Rings, you like Dungeons and Dragons, and you like to read, you can read our chapters now for free. And one of the things that we would love to do is kind of collaborate with the fandom, and get some feedback. Like, hey, what did you like? What didn't you like? Like, what are the questions that you have now? Because again, this is our first book. So our well, books, and we're just kind of curious. Like, this is a chance for a fandom to kind of have input on a book before it's published, which I love that idea. And if anybody else is doing that, please let me know, because I would love to love to go participate in that. But yeah, it just so if you sorry, I'm so scattered right now. World of Urda, that is our website. So
Okay.
World, WORLD, of OF Urda, URDA .com is our website. We're posting our chapters there. And then we're also posting our chapters on a website called Wattpad, which is basically social media for writers,
Okay.
writers and readers. So Wattpad is WATTPAD. And then we're also posting our chapters on Patreon. And the patrons get the chapters about a month early, and then we get their feedback and we make little changes, and then they go public. But you can still read them there for free. And then we're on social media, and that's the same handle pretty much everywhere, World of Urda. So primarily we focus on like our content right now does best on like TikTok and YouTube shorts, because we do a lot of videos. But we post everywhere, Instagram, Twitter.
That's good because you're building a little community as well.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah. And
And if you
I love community. It's so much fun to interact with people and to chat and have that collaboration. So if that sounds like something you would enjoy, then
yeah,
come on down.
and you're also building that suspense for when the book comes out. It's like Netflix, for example. I watched The Last Kingdom, the new film,
Mm-hmm,
The Seven Kings, and
mm-hmm,
it's that suspense of, oh, this is a date is coming out in a month or 2 months' time.
mm-hmm.
Here's a trailer for it, and you're like, oh shit. You're then invested at
Yeah,
that point, and you're like, oh, I
yeah,
wonder what happens, and that's when the interest starts.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So book one is all released now. You can go read book one. And again, remember, that's going to see the most changes. So if you know, let us know what you want to see, or what questions you have, from book one that you want answered for sure in book two and three. Because we think we know, right? We do our best to anticipate any questions that readers would have and be like, okay, what questions do we want to answer? Or make sure what questions are important to get answered, right? So book one is all released, and we're working on book two right now. But our pace slowed like a little bit because we started doing more in-depth rewrites as we went along. But we're still releasing chapters regularly.
How
So
long?
yeah.
How long are the books roughly, like in terms of pages?
Oh, I don't know, because they keep getting bigger. Right now, book one is the smallest, and I think that's fine. And book two, like book two and three, they're just like they're. I'm not the numbers person. My co-author is the numbers person, so he could give you the word count.
Okay.
I cannot remember, but they're fairly
Okay.
sizable
Probably
reads, which I would love. Like as a reader, I'm just like, yes, give me more. So
few hundred pages probably per book. Yeah.
probably,
Okay. So
yeah.
not a novella then, more of a novel.
No, yes, three novels.
Yeah, novels. Okay. Yeah, that's what I
Three
was trying to get at
novels.
because you were like, oh, we've gone back and we've added in this, and now I've started
Yes,
asking
yeah,
myself, like you said about questions. I thought, okay, well, how long is this book then?
yeah,
If that makes
yeah.
sense.
So
So,
three novels.
yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Fantastic. Is there anything else about the books that you would like the listeners to know?
Well, I
that
don't
you've
know.
not
I
mentioned
just
already?
mostly just like, yeah, if you enjoy it, let us know. If you have an issue with it, like if let us we're actually mostly interested in like questions and criticisms, believe it or not. Like we want input on this. And so if that sounds like a fun collaborative opportunity for you, then yeah, to come on and join us, join the ride. And then like if you like Lord of the Rings and Dungeons and Dragons, right now we're releasing new content where we discuss some of our favorite books that we've read and how they've influenced our writing. And so we talk a lot about, the book that we're talking about, but then we, go over and we talk about our book as well. So just if you're interested in the writing process at all, or the creative process and how this all comes about, yeah, that's what we're talking about.
Fantastic. Well, I've really enjoyed listening to you talk about your book and Lord of the Rings
Yeah.
and your own personal journey as well.
Yeah.
So we'll obviously put on the notes the name of the well
Yeah. Yeah.
the way people can reach out and read the parts of the book, etc. The author names, are they going to be in both your real names, or is it going to be a pen name?
Yeah, I think we're just gonna do our real names. We both have screen names because we both do a lot of online gaming. But
Okay.
I think we're just gonna go, I'm Christen Horne and then Jacob Wise. So
Okay.
those will be our author names.
That's
Yeah.
how people can look out for it if, for example, you decide to change the name of the first book from Overstrung to something else, for example.
Yes,
Um,
yes, yes,
yeah, okay,
yes.
that's great.
Yeah, and everything will be under World of Urda. That's staying.
Okay,
That's
World of
staying for sure. Yeah.
Order.com.
Yeah. And then the trilogy is called The Bell and the Bow. That's pretty set.
Okay, but okay,
Yeah.
perfect.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I'll put the notes up, well, the links, or you can send me all the links. I'll put them on the
Yeah.
note.
Yeah.
And it's been great having you on the show.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's been so good to
Excellent.
be here. It's a great conversation.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think it has inspired me to maybe look at writing my own at some point. But
Yeah.
I need
Yeah.
to think of an idea first.
Yeah.
So thanks
Yeah.
again.
It's just coming back down to like what's the story you want to tell? That
Tap
can be a
my
fun question
heart.
to start with. Yeah.
Exactly. Well,
Yeah.
thanks again, Krista.
Yeah. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.